Thank you very much for coming here.
My pleasure. Well, it's a delight for me to be here. I love St. Petersburg. I've spent some time here in the past, but not anywhere near enough. So thank you very much for this invitation. So what I'm going to do is to try to summarize 25 years of research on the nonprofit sector around the world. And so I hope that you will stop me if I confuse you, because there's a lot of material to compress. And what I attempt to do is to organize it around what I'm calling the 10 big myths about global nonprofit organizations. And I want to go through these 10 myths and show you the data that has come out of our work that challenges some of these myths and sheds interesting light on it. And it's a lot of material, and some of it is technical, but hopefully I will not lose you too badly. And if I go too quickly, please slow me down. So let me begin. 10 great myths of global civil society. When we started our work, there was no belief at all that there was such a thing as a civil society or nonprofit sector. You could not find it, you could not see it, you could not touch it, you could not find data on it. Most of the data systems in the world only acknowledge 2 sectors, or maybe 3, but one of them was the public sector, the government. The second was the business sector, and the third was the households. But that was it. And there was no separate identification of the nonprofit sector. And there were many reasons for that. So one of them is just the, well, first of all, we knew that there was something going on in our societies outside of the for-profit sector and outside of the government sector. This was in the late 80s, late 70s, early 80s. You know, something was brewing in Latin America and Africa. Even in this part of the world, that there was the emergence of a really significant set of organizations that had certain commonalities to them. But the problem was that it was just very confusing. There was an enormous amount of confusion that still exists about the terms that are used. And we were using many different words for the same thing. So voluntary sector, independent sector, civil society sector, charitable sector, non-governmental sector. These are all words that are supposed to explain what this is, but since there's so many, people get very confused. You know, what is the difference between non-governmental sector and voluntary sector? And so a very great terminological tangle. And then the organizations involved, enormously diverse. And people would say, well, what does an environmental group have to do with a hospital? You know, these are completely different worlds. They can't be thought of as the same thing. And then to complicate things, the data systems. And you're going to hear me talk a lot about the data systems. You know, how do we know what exists? We look at data to give us a feeling for the scope, the scale of some social phenomenon. But the data systems had no way to identify this set of organizations. And let me just introduce you, if you don't know, to what is called the System of National Accounts. The System of National Accounts. Anybody here heard of the SNA, the System of National Accounts? Okay, so your RUSTAT follows the System of National Accounts, and so does every statistical agency in the world. It's how we have a figure that represents the gross domestic product of every country and know that it is more or less the same thing. Otherwise, everybody would measure it differently, but that would make no sense because you couldn't compare it. So the economists 50, 60 years ago invented, maybe more than that, invented this thing called the System of National Accounts. It's the guidance system for all international economic statistics. So it's very powerful. And this system of national accounts divides every economy in the world, including yours, into these 5 economic sectors. One of them is called non-financial corporations, one of them is called financial corporations. That's seen as the private business sector. A third one is called government, general government sector. The fourth is called households, that's families operating on in household. And then there's this fifth one, which is very confusing, for reasons I'll show you. But it's we use the abbreviation NPISH to refer to it. It stands for non-profit institutions serving households in English. I don't know how you'll do translating that into Russian, but non-profit institutions serving households. So all the statisticians were comfortable thinking that this so-called NPISH sector captured all the nonprofits. And when we started to do our research, we went to the books that report on the size of this NPISH sector, and we discovered 2 very interesting things. The first one was only 22 countries had any data on this sector, suggesting that there were only 22 countries that had any nonprofits. We knew that was wrong. Virtually every country had nonprofits. Secondly, when you looked at the data, you realized that something was dreadfully wrong about the data, because countries that we knew had enormous nonprofit sectors were showing up in this data as very infinitesimal nonprofits. So, for example, anybody here been to Germany and know anything about German nonprofits? What do you know about it?
That they cooperate with the government a lot.
Okay, that's good. You know what they're called? You know what the name of some of the networks?
Give me a second.
It has to do with the Catholic Church.
Exactly. Yes. Caritas.
Caritas.
And yes.
Okay. So Caritas, there's a Caritas network in Germany. There's the Protestant Welfare Works in Germany. Each of these is an enormous network of organizations. They run most of the hospitals, most of the daycare centers, all the homes for elderly people, the kindergartens. They clearly are the largest employer in the country of all the industries, and yet in the statistics that we had from Germany, it showed us that only 0.1% of the value-added contribution to GDP came from these nonprofit institutions serving households. Something was clearly wrong. So we did some checking, and here's what we found. We found that this system works pretty well for private corporations, that it works pretty well for government units, works very well for households. But when it comes to nonprofits, we discovered a very striking thing, that not all nonprofits get put into the nonprofit institutions serving households. Why is that? Because the statisticians use the following rule to decide what sector an economic entity goes into. And that rule is, where does he get his money? That's the only thing that they care about. And if you are a market producer, that is to say, if you charge something for a service that you provide, or if you get a government contract which acts like a purchase of service, you're put into the corporation sector. So my university, Johns Hopkins, which is a nonprofit institution, we charge our students tuition. I know this sounds outrageous to those of you who are in more enlightened countries, but we charge them to pay us to come and teach our classes. Therefore, we are a market producer, even though we're a nonprofit. And therefore, under the rules of this SNA, we got put into the market sector. Once you get put into the market sector, look what happens. You disappear from view. You're no longer identified as a nonprofit. The only ones that are identified as nonprofits are organizations that get all of their funding from philanthropy. And as you'll hear in a minute, this is not the norm around the world, that nonprofits get most of their money from philanthropy. In fact, most of the significant economic units, like hospitals and universities around the world, get most of their funding from other sources. Therefore, they don't show up in NPISH. they disappear from view, and therefore we all were operating under an incorrect notion that this was a very trivial part of the world's economy. It simply couldn't be seen. And so what we said was, that's fine with one lens for looking at the world. But this requires a new lens. And a lot of my work has taken the form of providing a new pair of glasses. When I take my glasses off, all the beautiful women in the back of the room, I hate to say it, I can't see you, which makes me very sad. But when I put my glasses on, voila, you come into view. So it is with our statistics. The statistics are the window through which we see the world, the lens. And when the lens is confused or distorted, as it is in this case, we can't see you. We can't see these organizations. So what we began to do was to fashion a new set of lens, a new concept around which to organize data. And we did it not because we wanted only to show the economics of the sector. We did it because we wanted to see the sector, because only if you can see it can you really effectively represent it. Can you effectively defend it? Can you effectively rally people to support it? And so a lot of our work has taken the form of fashioning a new set of lenses and gathering data. So we created something called the Johns Hopkins Comparative Nonprofit Sector Project. Some of you may have encountered it in some of our writings. I apologize for all the writings that I've imposed on you indirectly. But it, for the first time, began to bring this sector into view, and not just in one country. We ultimately have been working in 42 countries around the world, including here in Russia, where we developed the first empirical data on this sector in this country, but so too in many other countries. To do this work, obviously, we had to come up with a definition. What is this sector? What are the common elements? And people said, this is crazy, it's too much diversity, but we were very stubborn, and we pointed out that so too is the business sector very diverse, but somehow people have found a way to come up with a definition of what the business sector is, so why can't we do it for the nonprofit sector? Ultimately, we developed a definition that has been focused on 5 features that really carve out this sector from all the other institutions in our societies. So we said, yes, they are organizations, but they don't have to be registered, because we know in some countries of the world, the registration is restricted. So we had to define it in a way, in a sociological sense, as a group of people who come together, who have a certain durability to their gathering, and who have a set of rules. So a very sociological concept of organization. They had to be private. They had to be institutionally separate from government. We were not interested in organizations that were institutionally part of government. And we used that word so that we could include organizations that received money from government, but so long as they retained some degree of autonomy, institutional separation, they would fit into our definition. Thirdly, they had to be non-profit distribution, non-profit distributing organizations. Since we use the term non-profit, it gets confusing. People think you cannot earn profit as a non-profit, but that's really not what the concept is. The concept is you can earn profit, but it cannot be distributed to a set of owners or a set of investors. It has to be put back into the charitable purpose. So these are organizations that are non-profit distributing. Very important distinction to make. So for-profit companies that can distribute profit cannot be included. Fourthly, they had to be self-governing. They had to have their own capability of governing themselves, and the test that we used on that was at the end of the day, the organizations could put themselves out of existence. They could vote to go out of business. So our university, our board, could decide tomorrow that we do not want to remain as a university. Our laws require that any assets we own be given to the same charitable purpose. It's not simply put in the pocket of the directors. This is the ultimate test, whereas a state university would require some decision by government to close down, and nonprofits do not require that. And then finally, these organizations had to be non-compulsory. That is to say, your participation in them was not required. So that differentiates them from tribes, from castes, from families, all of which are, once you're born into it, you're into it. You don't have a choice. So this defined a huge set of types of entities. Everything from trade associations, that is professional associations like a bar association or association of bankers, they're included because they fit this criteria. So too are human rights organizations and environmental organizations, and some universities, not all, they have to fit these criteria in order to be included. So that became the sort of mantra, the organization of this structure. So the belief that the nonprofit sector didn't exist was a product of having no data on it, and the product having no data was a product of having no tangible, concrete, operationalizable definition. And we solved that problem and then went forward. So, second myth. There's nothing that the nonprofit sector does that government or the market can also do and do better. This is a widespread belief. Why do we need a nonprofit sector? Particularly if we have a democratic government, but even if we don't, and so long as we have a market system, why would we need a nonprofit sector? And the answer to that is important because it explains, why worry about this? Why be concerned about this sector? So it's worth reflecting for a minute on why we have a nonprofit sector. So one of the functions that it performs clearly is a function that is also performed by these other sectors. That is the service function. It delivers healthcare, it delivers housing, it provides education. But I think the argument is that the nonprofit sector does it with a certain plus. There's a certain advantage that it brings in the way it delivers these services. First of all, it has a lot more flexibility than does the state. Secondly, it frequently is an innovator and therefore is already working on a problem before the state decides to take it up. This is true, for example, with AIDS and end-of-life situations and homeless people. These are issues where there's a certain stigmatization of the populations, therefore there's not enough support to have a government program. And what do we find? Nonprofits are out there already working. And when the state finally comes around, you've got a set of organizations with experience and capability that are doing the job. They operate on a human scale, another problem that we've had with the huge government bureaucracies, particularly in the human service field, that they are so big and so cumbersome, however they try to produce quality services, that it just doesn't come across as the kind of quality that people increasingly are expecting. A third advantage of nonprofits is that they can create holistic approaches. They can treat the person completely instead of having all the support come down through very stringent, something we refer to as silos of individual programs. The Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Education can't seem to get together to deliver a combination of healthcare and training, so they deliver them differently and in separate ways to different people. Nonprofits can come together and produce more holistic approaches. And then, of course, they bring special resources. They bring into the arena philanthropy, however large or small it is, and volunteers, which turn out to be a huge added resource to the solution of these problems. And then finally, they have the added advantage of promoting civic engagement, citizen engagement in the solution of public policy, which is a kind of activation of citizens in a way that is increasingly important. So that's one function. But then there are more functions, and there's a real mistake in restricting the focus of the nonprofit sector and its contribution to service functions. In addition to service functions, it has advocacy functions. It helps to shine a light on problems that government should be dealing with and is not, or assessing the quality of the government services. So this becomes a crucial part of why nonprofits are so so important. It gives expression to positions and concerns that are not yet being heard, issues of poverty or racial injustice or religious discrimination. The sector provides that kind of expressive voice. It organizes people with voice. It builds what's increasingly being referred to as social capital. Has any of you heard this term, social capital? So we got, we have physical capital, that's buildings we're in. There's financial capital, that's the money we have. There's human capital, that's the skills that we all carry around in our heads. But now, increasingly, there's focus on social capital. And social capital are the bonds of trust and reciprocity that exist among people that turn out to be crucial for the operation of markets and turn out to be crucial also for the operation of political systems, the democratic political system. So nonprofits have been found to be very crucial to the generation of social capital. And countries that are doing well economically tend to be shown to have high levels of social capital. And people who study this attribute a lot of the construction of social capital to the getting together that people experience through nonprofit organizations. And then finally, they are the guardian of a very important value. So what nonprofits do uniquely compared to all the other institutions in society is that they mobilize private initiative, which is what the market brings to the table, for public purposes, which is what the government brings to the table. So they combine two things that don't appear together in the other sectors. They combine something from the market system and something from the public system. So their great advantage is their ability to mobilize private initiative, individual initiative for the common good. There's a vehicle through which people can decide, I am really concerned about this problem, and I want to do something about it, and so I'm going to form a nonprofit and I'm going to work on it, instead of waiting around until the government decides to do something. So this is a very valuable phenomenon. So this is a sector with very significant additions that it brings to society that the other sectors don't. So it's not the case that there's nothing that nonprofits do that the government or the ones can't do. The truth is that it's got a number of things that this sector alone can do without which we would be third sector, third myth. It's a very widely held belief that this sector, whatever it is a bunch of do-gooding people who are operating on the margin that don't really add up to a lot when it comes to hard economic impact. It's a kind of a way to dismiss the sector as being kind of unimportant. And so we began to gather data on this sector around the world. And the facts turn out to be just overwhelmingly to refute this. This is one of the examples of the books that we have inflicted on all of these poor students to bring our data to people's attention. This turns out to be an enormous economic resource. As of the late, I guess, 2000s, there were at least 48.5 million full-time equivalent jobs in nonprofits in the 42 countries in which we had data. So it was close to 5% of the economically active population. Anytime you have 5% of the economy of a country, you're talking about an enormous presence. We calculated the revenue of the nonprofit sector, and we compared it to the, can you all see that? We compared it to the total revenue of the nonprofit sector in the 41 countries that we had data on. And what emerges from that is that the nonprofit sector in the world would be the 5th largest economy in the world if it were a separate country. That begins to give a sense of the enormous scale of this sector. This shows you the employment in the civil society organizations and nonprofit organizations. We used as terms interchangeably, in the 37 countries in which we can get this data, compared to the largest private company in each one of those countries. So we compared the nonprofit employment in those countries to the largest, the sum of the total of all the largest companies, like General Motors in the United States, and I forget which one it was in Japan, but really large private companies. And what emerged is that the 48 million nonprofit workers were 12 times bigger than this combined employment in the largest company in each one of those countries. Which is a sign of sort of, the largest company in a country gets a lot of attention. Nonprofits tend not to get a lot of attention. And this shows you that if we put it all together, it turns out that the nonprofit sector is just an enormous economic presence. So that's the third great myth that comes crashing down when you begin to get data. A fourth myth is that, okay, yes, it's big, but it's all America. That's the only country that has a sizable nonprofit sector, and it's so big that it just sort of overwhelms all the other countries in the world. So we have gathered data, as I said, on 42 countries, and here's the story. And I guess the fifth myth, let's put it all together, is that wherever the sector exists, it certainly doesn't exist in Scandinavia. This is the myth. Scandinavia has a welfare state, we all know that. So why would they need a nonprofit sector? So again, we started to do some data on this. It is true that the U.S. has a big nonprofit sector. If you add the volunteers in and convert them into full-time equivalent workers, they add up all their hours divided by the typical work, how many hours they may work a year, and come up with a full-time equivalent worker. It's the largest workforce in the country. It's bigger than retail trade, about 18 million people, full-time working people, bigger than retail trade, bigger than manufacturing. If you don't like including volunteers, it's still the third largest without the volunteers taken into account. So this is just a huge component of the workforce in our country. But the real surprise is when we look at where the U.S. stands in relation to other countries in the world, you have to come down pretty far in this chart. It's number 9. I used to have a pointer, but I don't seem to have it here. So, it's okay. You missed all the good stuff. There are a lot of countries that are ahead of the United States on that chart. This is the share of the workforce of the economically active population, basically adult population of these countries, that the nonprofit sector represents. And in the U.S., the figure is about 9%. But look at the Netherlands. It's up there at close to 16% of the workforce. Huge nonprofit sector in the Netherlands, similarly with Germany. So what's striking about this is that the countries at the highest level in this chart, we all have been thinking about as welfare states. We use the term welfare state to refer to most of Western Europe. It turns out that they're not welfare states. If by welfare states you mean states in which the government both pays for and delivers most of the social welfare services. What this chart tells us is that what they've really created are welfare partnerships in which the state is financing for sure, and I think the young lady in the back pointed out that there's a lot of funding coming from the state to the nonprofit sector in Germany, and that is true, but German bureaucracy is not delivering most of the human services, the hospitals, many of the education institutions, the nursing homes. They are being run by nonprofit institutions, and this has become a very, very widespread pattern all through Western Europe. And so suddenly, with this little bit of data, we have turned over the whole concept of the welfare state. We've forced people to rethink what is the reality of the welfare state in Western Europe, and it turns out that it's simply not a welfare state. Yeah, okay, what about Russia? I was going to keep it a secret, but of course me too. Right. Now this data is a little bit old, so but I think it's as of 2010. As a percent, I mean, if you look absolutely at the Russian nonprofit sector, it is quite big. You know, the employment is about 800,000 workers, and that's a pretty big considering how big it is in absolute size in other countries. But in percentage terms, it's you know, around 1%. So it's down, and as you can see, you're not alone. Many of the states in Central and Eastern Europe, and this should not be a complete surprise because, of course, this sector was constrained for so long that it simply has not built up. And you'll see in a minute part of the reason for that. It has to do with the relation between the state and the sector, and particularly the financing sector. And that's why the work that we're doing at the Higher School of Economics right now is trying to understand these new government support programs for nonprofits to assess, you know, how real are they, and are they really a turning point in the development of the sector? Who's getting that money, and is it the organizations that we would like to believe are getting it? So, and a couple of other things on the economic scale. This is a little more complicated chart, but there's a certain tendency around the world to assume that these are low-paid jobs in the nonprofit sector. And I know this will be hard to believe given where the Russian nonprofit sector is, but globally, it seems to be the case that within the industries in which nonprofits are active, the wages are actually higher. And you can see this is the U.S., and obviously it's not necessarily representative of the whole world. But if you look at just all industries, the purple is the nonprofit average wage per month, and the blue is is the for-profit. So if you look at all industries, yeah, for-profit wages are higher, but it's not because nonprofits don't do as well, it's that they're in different industries. And generally speaking, service industries have lower wages than manufacturing and other industries. So when you do the comparison within industries, you know, you look at hospitals, nonprofits are way ahead. You look at elementary and secondary education, nonprofits are way ahead. You look at nursing homes, nonprofits have an edge. You look at social assistance, the average wage of nonprofits is actually higher. So again, this is an industry that employs people and is paying in the industries in which it's working, paying decent wages. And this story also, the data I've been showing you, most of it is employment data. When we begin to get economic data, that is contribution to GDP, which we have been able to get because we have convinced the statistical authorities who oversee the system of national accounts to let us write this handbook on nonprofit institutions in the system of national accounts. It's an official United Nations handbook. It calls on every statistical agency in the world to produce data separately on nonprofit institutions for the first time ever. And so it's a machine that will give us these data on a regular basis over time. So it's an important breakthrough. And it produces data on the economics of the sector. And this is a report that we did. It's on our website that uses the first data coming out of these officially produced statistics. The stuff that I've been showing you came out of our research project. And what I'm now going to show you came out of the work of actual statistical agencies, and it's a similar story. The U.S. is a little higher, but it's because we don't have as many of the countries in it. This shows you the contribution to GDP by these nonprofit organizations as computed by the statistics agencies of the world. So we're beginning to get really solid data from the statistics agencies. And when you look there, particularly when you look in particular fields and ask what's the contribution to nonprofits in these different fields, this happens to be data from Belgium. And it's basically saying that 66% of the value added to the economy in Belgium in the field of social services is being generated by nonprofits. So this is an expression of just how crucial this sector is in delivering and producing value added in different fields, and the health field is 40% of the total. Okay, so a sixth. So what we've discovered is there is a possibility of defining a set of entities called the nonprofit sector and treat it as a sector. It has special functions and contributions that it makes. It is not a trivial economic force. It's not only the U.S. To the contrary, many countries in Western Europe are well ahead of the U.S. So now we come to this point about the relationship between volunteers and paid staff, which is a very important point in the general understanding of the sector. So some really interesting findings came out of our work on the whole question of volunteer work. The first thing we learned is that volunteers are an enormous part of the workforce of the sector. You know, almost half, 44% of the full-time equivalent workers in the nonprofit sector globally are volunteers. So it's an enormous workforce that is out of the sector. We found that this was pretty widespread. You know, there's not a big difference between developing and developed countries. Most of that was due to the Nordic countries. And here's the answer to the question of how it is that Sweden and Norway and Denmark can have both a welfare state that delivers most welfare services and a huge nonprofit sector. And the answer is because they're much more heavily staffed by volunteers. The share of the total workforce that are volunteers in those countries is much, much higher. So this is the volunteers as a percent of the nonprofit workforce by these different regional clusters. So overall, it's about 44%, but in the Nordic countries, it gets up to 64 or 65% of the workforce. They have been particularly active in rallying volunteers through nonprofit organizations to deliver culture, to deliver recreation, to deliver sports, but also increasingly in human services. So a very different composition of the workforce, but it's still being mobilized and operated by nonprofits. So we then did some estimating. We said, what if we put all the world's volunteers on one landmass, forgetting about how many hours they worked as volunteers, but just put them all together, what would it look like? And what we concluded is that it would be the second most populous country in the world, behind China and India. I don't know that all of you who were volunteers wanted to live somewhere together, but if you did, you'd make a very big country. And if you put economic value on it,